The rain had been falling on the small village for 3 days straight, and the puddles in the dirt road had grown wide enough to reflect the gray sky above, like broken mirrors scattered across the ground. Tavelk stood inside the observation pod, hovering 6,000 meters above the surface of the little blue world, and watched through the long-range sensor array as a human child stumbled out of a shelter made of wood and stone. The child was small and soft, and barely able to walk without falling, and it wandered on unsteady legs toward the largest puddle near the road, and then it stopped. Tavelk leaned closer to the display and adjusted the magnification with 2 of his 6 limbs, while the other 4 kept him balanced in the swaying pod. The child looked down into the water and saw something looking back at it. For a moment, nothing happened, and the child simply stared, and then its tiny face twisted into something Tavelk had never seen on a creature so young. It was anger. The child swung its hand down and slapped the water hard enough to send droplets flying into the air, and the reflection shattered into 1,000 ripples, and the child screamed at it, and hit it again, and again, and again. Tavelk felt something cold move through his chest, and it was not fear exactly, but something closer to recognition, as if he had just watched something very old and very dangerous wake up for the first time. The child began to cry after the 5th strike, because the reflection kept coming back, and no matter how hard it hit the water, the face beneath the surface would not go away, and would not stop staring back. And then the child did something that made Tavelk set down his data recorder and simply watch in silence. It stopped crying and wiped its face with the back of one wet hand, and hit the water again. Not harder this time, but with a strange new calm, as if it had accepted that it could not win, and had decided that losing was not a good enough reason to stop. Tavelk had studied 412 species across 9 galactic sectors, and he had seen predators and prey and hive minds and solitary hunters and every variation of life the universe had chosen to produce. And not once in his long career had he seen anything like this. He opened his log and recorded a single note. This species does not accept what it sees in itself, and instead of looking away, it declares war. He paused and added one more line. I do not know what to do with this information. The report reached the Concord Senate on the station world of Ilveth 3 rotations later, and it arrived at the worst possible time, because the Senate was already struggling with a crisis it had been ignoring for 600 years. The Vrecht were growing. Everyone knew it, and nobody wanted to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean admitting that the Concord's oldest and most sacred strategy was failing. The strategy was simple, and it had worked for 11,000 years, and it went like this. Every species has a nature, and if you understand that nature, you can predict what it will do, and if you can predict what it will do, you can keep the peace. The Kenthari were philosophers, so you gave them libraries, and they were content. The Drathai were warriors, so you gave them borders to guard, and they were satisfied. The Ilhari were empaths, so you gave them diplomatic roles, and they thrived. And the Vrecht were destroyers, so you gave them space. You simply moved out of their way and let them consume whatever empty systems they wanted. And you told yourself that this was wisdom and not cowardice, and you slept well at night because you had maintained the peace. But the Vrecht had taken 43 inhabited systems in the last 2 centuries, and giving them space was starting to look less like philosophy and more like. It was into this tension that Tavelk's report landed like a stone dropped into still water. The Senate reviewed the data on the newly discovered species from the quarantined death world in the Outer Arm, and they were not sure what to make of it. Archetype classification, demanded High Senator Morvek of the Drathi, and his heavy-plated jaw ground sideways as he spoke, which was a sign of impatience in his kind. The classification AI returned its result, and the chamber went silent. Archetype null. No stable behavioral identity detected. The species exhibited predator behavior and nurturing behavior simultaneously, and it formed herds, but also fought within those herds constantly. And it built civilizations, and then burned them down, and then built them again. The AI could not find a pattern, because there was no pattern. There was only contradiction. Quarantine them, said Morvek immediately. Agreement, because the unknown was dangerous, and the Concord had survived for 11,000 years by understanding exactly what everything was. But one voice cut through the noise, and it belonged to Saith of the Ilhari. She was old even by Ilhari standards, and her crystalline body caught the chamber lights, and scattered them across the walls in soft blue patterns that shifted with her mood. And right now those patterns were moving in ways that none of her colleagues had ever seen before. I will go, she said. The chamber fell silent again. I will go to this world, and I will read them, and I will tell you what they are. Morvek snorted, which sounded like two boulders scraping together, and said, You want to walk into a death world full of unclassified creatures because of one child hitting a puddle. I want to walk into a death world, Saith replied calmly, because in 400 years of empathic service, I have never once failed to read a species, and I find myself genuinely curious whether this will be the first time. The Senate voted narrowly to approve her mission, and Saith left the chamber and began preparing her vessel. And as she walked through the long corridors of Ilvet Station, she passed a window that looked out onto the stars, and she caught her own reflection in the glass. She stopped. She looked at herself, and her reflection looked back. And for one brief, strange moment, she thought about the child in the puddle, and wondered what it must feel like to see yourself and not recognize what you are. She decided it must feel terrible. She was wrong about that. It felt like war, and humanity had been fighting it since the first one of them opened its eyes and saw its own shadow stretching out behind it on the ground, and thought, not that is me, but that is something I need to defeat. Saith's ship left Ilvet Station the next morning and pointed itself toward the outer arm, and the small blue world, where a species that could not be classified was busy doing what it had always done, fighting everything, including itself, especially itself. Saith had expected many things when she arrived in the system the humans called Sol, but she had not expected to be hailed on 6 different communication frequencies by 3 different governments before she even passed the outer gas giant. That is not one civilization, said her navigation officer, a young Kenthari named Palak, who had 4 of his 6 limbs pressed flat against the console in what Saith recognized as deep confusion. No, Saith agreed, and she watched the data streams pour in and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Earth had one government, and Mars had another, and the stations and mining operations spread across the asteroid belt had formed a third, and all 3 of them were arguing with each other on open channels that anyone could hear. They were not even trying to hide it. Saith had visited first contact scenarios before, and every species she had ever met had presented a unified face to outsiders, because that was what you did. When you met someone new, and you wanted to appear strong, humanity apparently had not received that instruction. The Earth delegation wanted to welcome her with ceremony, and the Mars delegation wanted to scan her ship for weapons first, and the Belt delegation wanted to know if she had any trade goods, and all 3 of them were telling the other 2 to shut up. Saith felt the first flicker of something she had not felt in a very long time. Doubt. They brought her to a station orbiting Earth, and the meeting room they gave her was large and bright and filled with humans who all looked slightly different from each other, in ways that Saith found deeply strange, because most species had very little physical variation within their populations. The lead diplomat was a woman named Captain Rena Vasquez, and she was not what Saith had expected either. Rena was tall and lean with dark hair pulled back tight, and a face that could shift from warm laughter to cold. calculation in the space of a single breath. And when she shook Sayeth's crystalline hand, she did it firmly but gently, as if she understood exactly how much pressure the crystal could take. "Welcome to our mess," Rena said, and she smiled, and the smile was real. Sayeth reached out with her empathic senses and tried to read Rena the way she had read 10,000 beings before. And what she found made her pull back so fast that her light patterns flared red. There was no single emotion inside Rena Vasquez. There were hundreds. Kindness and suspicion lived side by side, and genuine warmth sat next to a cold willingness to do terrible things if necessary. And love for her people coexisted with a deep exhaustion that came from knowing exactly what those people were capable of. It was like trying to read a book where every page was written in a different language. Sayeth composed herself and smiled back because she was a professional, and said, "Thank you, Captain. And I must say, your species is quite unlike anything I have encountered." "We get that a lot," Rena said. The negotiations lasted several days, and Sayeth learned more about humanity in those days than she had in all her years of study. And most of what she learned confused her. They fought with each other constantly, but would unite instantly against an outside threat, and then go right back to fighting each other the moment the threat was gone. They built beautiful things, and then neglected them, and then mourned their loss, and then built them again. They were capable of breathtaking cruelty and staggering kindness, and sometimes the same individual would demonstrate both within the same hour. Sayeth sent a report to the Concord every evening, and each report was longer and more uncertain than the last. On the 5th day, Rena invited Sayeth to dinner, and over food that Sayeth could not eat, but appreciated the gesture of being offered, Rena asked a question that changed everything. "So what is the Concord actually afraid of out there?" Sayeth considered lying, and then decided that Rena would probably see through it, because humans seem to have an unsettling talent for detecting dishonesty. "The Vrecht," Sayeth said. She explained what the Vrecht were, a parasitic hive mind that moved from system to system, consuming everything in its path. And she explained that the Vrecht had been expanding for centuries, and she explained the Concord's strategy of withdrawal and acceptance. Rena listened without interrupting, which Sayeth had already learned was unusual for a human. And when Sayeth finished, Rena set down her glass and stared at the table for a long time. "Let me make sure I understand this," Rena said slowly. "You have an enemy that eats your worlds, and your strategy is to let them. It is their nature to consume," Sayeth said. "We accept this as we accept all natures." "And how many worlds have you lost?" 43 inhabited systems over 2 centuries. Rena closed her eyes, and Sayeth felt a wave of emotion crash through the human, so intense that it almost knocked her empathic senses offline. It was not fear. It was not anger exactly, although anger was part of it. It was something Sayeth had no word for in any language she spoke, and the closest she could come was refusal, but that was not big enough for what she felt radiating out of this woman. Rena opened her eyes, and they were hard and bright, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it filled the entire room. "What if it is our nature to disagree with that?" Sayeth did not know what to say. Rena stood up and said, "I want everything you have on the Vrecht, and I mean everything. Fleet movements and system locations, and biology and tactics and communication patterns, and every single piece of intelligence you have gathered in 600 years of running away from them." "To what end?" Sayeth asked. "To the end where they stop taking your worlds." "You cannot be serious," Sayeth said, and for the first time in 400 years, her voice cracked. "You have known about the Vrecht for 5 days, and you are proposing to fight a war that the Concord has avoided for 6 centuries. Rena leaned forward and put both hands flat on the table and said, "Sayeth, I have known about things like the Vrecht my entire life, because my species has been the Vrecht to itself for thousands of years, and we have been fighting that war every single day, and we are still here." She straightened up and adjusted her uniform and smiled again, But this time the smile had teeth. "Get me the intelligence, and I will get you your worlds back." Saif sent one final report to the Concorde that night, and it was the shortest one she had ever written. "They are going to fight the Vrecht," it read. "Not because we asked them to, and not because it benefits them, but because something inside them simply cannot tolerate the existence of a thing they have not tried to defeat. And I do not know whether this is the bravest thing I have ever seen, or the most insane. And I suspect it is both." The Concorde received the report, and the Senate erupted into chaos, and Morvek called it madness, and the Drothi Military Council called it suicide, and the Kenthari philosophers called it fascinating. And far away, on a station orbiting a small blue world, a woman named Rena Vasquez sat alone in her quarters, and stared at battle plans spread across her desk, and caught her own reflection in the dark screen of a powered-down console. She looked at it for a long time. "You had better be right about this," she said to herself. Her reflection said nothing back, but she went to war anyway. The first human fleet crossed into Vrecht-contested space 14 months after first contact with the Concorde, and the galaxy held its breath. Tavelk watched, from the observation vessel Gentle Inquiry, as 312 human warships arranged themselves into formations that no Concorde military strategist recognized, because they were not formations at all. They were arguments. The Earth contingent favored tight defensive clusters, and the Mars contingent preferred wide, aggressive spreads, and the Belt contingent flew in loose, chaotic swarms that seemed to have no pattern, and all three of them were broadcasting tactical disagreements on channels that the Vrecht could absolutely hear. "They are going to die," said Morvek, who had insisted on being present for what he called the inevitable collapse. And his heavy jaw ground sideways with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been grief. Tavelk said nothing, because he was watching Rena Vasquez's command ship, the INS Defiance, and he was waiting to see what she would do. The first engagement happened in the Kelori system, which the Vrecht had consumed 30 years earlier, and what had once been a thriving Concorde colony world was now a gray husk, covered in organic structures that pulsed like a giant heartbeat. The Vrecht responded to the human fleet exactly the way they responded to every threat. They studied it. The hive mind reached out with its vast psychic network and touched the edges of the human fleet, and tasted their thoughts and emotions and fears, and then it did what it always did. It became a mirror. Within hours, the Vrecht began adapting, and their attack patterns shifted to exploit exactly the fractures that already existed in the human coalition. They sent fast raiders against the Earth ships because the Earth crews feared being overwhelmed, and they sent heavy siege vessels against the Mars ships because the Mars crews feared being outgunned, and they sent nothing at all against the Belt ships because the Belt crews feared being ignored and forgotten more than anything else. And it worked. The human fleet began to crack along exactly the lines that had always been there, and the old resentments between Earth and Mars and Belt that had been buried under the excitement of a shared mission came roaring back to the surface. Earth captains accused Mars captains of recklessness, and Mars captains accused Earth captains of cowardice, and Belt captains accused everyone of treating them like expendable miners who could be thrown away, and the communication channels filled with shouting and blame. Tavelk recorded everything with the careful patience of a scientist watching a predicted outcome unfold, and beside him, Saith watched with her light patterns cycling through shades of blue that meant sorrow. "They are fighting their own shadow," Tavelk said quietly, "as they always have." Vrecht pushed harder, and the fractures deepened, and 3 Earthships broke formation and retreated, and a Mars destroyer fired a warning shot at a Belt frigate that had drifted into its lane. And for one terrible hour, it looked like the human fleet was going to tear itself apart, before the Vrecht even needed to finish the job. Rena Vasquez watched all of this from the bridge of the Defiance, and said nothing for a very long time. Her officers waited, and the bridge crew waited, and the entire fleet waited, because everyone knew that the Admiral had to say something, and whatever she said would either save them or end them. Rena stood up from her command chair and walked to the forward viewport, and looked out at the chaos of her fleet and the gray dead world below, and the wrecked ships circling like patient scavengers. She saw her own face reflected in the glass. It looked tired and scared and angry and old, and she stared at it the way that child in the puddle had stared at its own reflection all those years ago on a rainy road on Earth. And then she opened the fleet-wide channel and began to speak. "This is Admiral Vasquez," she said, and her voice was rough and unsteady, and she did not try to make it sound strong. "I am going to say something that no admiral is supposed to say, so listen carefully, because I am only going to say it once." She took a breath. "We are losing, and we are losing because the wrecked figured out something about us that we already knew but did not want to admit. We are a mess." Silence across every channel. Earth thinks Mars is reckless, and Mars thinks Earth is weak, and the Belt thinks nobody cares about them. And you know what the worst part is? All of that is true. More silence. Mars is reckless, and Earth is cautious to the point of paralysis, and the Belt has been treated like garbage for 100 years, and every single one of those wounds is real, and I am not going to stand here and tell you to forget about them, because you cannot forget something that is part of who you are. She turned away from the viewport and faced the bridge crew, and there were tears on her face, but her jaw was set hard. The wrecked want us to fight each other, because fighting each other is what we do best, and they are right about that. We are really, really good at fighting each other. A few bitter laughs crackled across the channel. But here is the thing they got wrong. They think that because we fight each other, we cannot fight together. And that is the mistake that every enemy we have ever faced has made, because we have been fighting each other and fighting together at the same time for our entire history. And we are still here. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. I am not asking you to be united, because we have never been united, and pretending otherwise is a lie. And I am done lying, and I am done pretending, and I am done trying to be something. We are not. Her voice dropped low and hard. I am asking you to be what we actually are. Angry and scared and petty and brave and selfish and kind and broken and stubborn and completely unwilling to stay down when something knocks us over. She pointed out the viewport at the wrecked fleet. Those things out there looked inside us and saw every ugly thing we have ever been, and they thought that would stop us, and I need you to show them why that was the worst mistake they have ever made. She paused. All ships reform on me, and if you want to yell at each other while you do it, go ahead, because I do not care how you feel about each other right now. I care that you fight. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then the Belt frigates moved first, because the Belt had always been the ones who had the least to lose and the most to prove, and they swung into formation around the Defiance like a ragged honor guard. Then Mars moved, because Mars never could stand to let someone else lead the charge. And then Earth moved, because Earth could never stand to be the ones who stayed behind. It was not pretty, and it was not clean, and 3 captains were still arguing on open channels as they reformed, and one Belt pilot was crying, and a Mars gunnery officer was swearing in 4 languages. But they moved, and the wrecked felt something shift in the psychic field around the human fleet. Not unity exactly, but something harder to break than unity. It was stubbornness. It was the absolute bone-deep refusal of a species that had been fighting its own reflection since the first day it could see, and had never once won, and had never once stopped trying. The reformed fleet hit the wrecked line like a fist made of broken fingers, and it should not have worked, and by every tactical model it should not have worked. But it worked, because the wrecked had built their entire strategy around the assumption that a fractured enemy would scatter, undone. They had never met an enemy that fought best when it was fractured. The Battle of Kellery lasted 9 more hours, and when it was over the human fleet had taken terrible losses. 41 ships destroyed, and 100 more damaged, and thousands of names that would be carved into memorials that had not been built yet. But the Vrecht were driven from the system. It was the first time in 600 years that the Vrecht had been pushed out of a system they had claimed. On the observation vessel, Morvek sat in silence for a long time, and then he said that should not have worked. Tavolk looked at him and said, "No, it should not have." "Then why did it?" Tavolk thought about a child in a puddle hitting its own reflection, and said, "Because they were not fighting the Vrecht. They were fighting themselves, and they have more practice at that than anyone in the galaxy." Morvek had no answer for that. Neither did the Vrecht. The Vrecht core was in a dying star system that the Concord had named the Hollow, because nothing lived there except the hive mind itself, and the light of the ancient red sun barely reached the outer planets, where the Nexus station sat like a tumor grown on the bones of a dead world. Rena stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked at the tactical display and felt the weight of what she was about to do settle onto her shoulders like a second skeleton. The fleet had fought its way across 11 systems in 8 months, and every system had cost them. And the cost was measured in ships and lives and sleep and sanity. And the fleet that had started as 312 vessels was now 187. But they were here. "Admiral," said her tactical officer, a young belt woman named Kai Chen, whose hands had not stopped shaking since the Battle of Pelorum 3 weeks ago. "The Concord observer ships are requesting permission to hold at the system." "Edge." "Granted," Rena said. "Tell them to keep their distance and their cameras running, because one way or another, this is going to be worth recording." The Vrecht knew they were coming, because the Vrecht always knew, and as the human fleet advanced into the Hollow, the hive mind began to deploy something that no Concord species had ever survived: the mirror field. It started as a whisper at the edge of every human mind on every ship, a soft voice that sounded exactly like their own thoughts, and it said things that were true. To the pilot on the destroyer Rampart, it said, "You left your sister behind on Mars, and you told yourself it was duty, but it was really because you were afraid of watching her die." To the engineer on the cruiser Steady Hand, it said, "You drink every night because you know you are not smart enough for this job, and one day your mistake will kill everyone on this ship." To the Marine sergeant on the assault carrier Born Angry, it said, "You enjoy this, and you have always enjoyed this, and the uniform is just an excuse to do what you really are, which is a killer." And to every single human in the fleet, it said the same thing underneath all the specific cruelties: "Look at yourself and see what you really are, and stop pretending." The effect was devastating. Ships began to slow as crews turned inward, and the psychic assault was not pain exactly, but something worse, because pain could be endured, but truth was harder to survive. Tavolk watched from the observation vessel as the human fleet decelerated, and he could see the biometric data streaming from the ships, and every heart rate was spiking, and every stress hormone was flooding, and people were sitting down at their stations and putting their heads in their hands. "It is over," Morvek said, and there was no satisfaction in his voice this time, only a heavy sadness. "The mirror field has broken every species that has faced it, and the humans will be no different." Sayek said nothing because she was reaching out with her empathic senses toward the human fleet, and what she felt there was not what she expected. They were not breaking. They were remembering. Every human in that fleet was being forced to look at the worst version of themselves, and the Vrecht expected this to destroy them, the way it had destroyed the Kelori and the Shen and the Varathi and every other species that had been consumed, because those species had never seen themselves clearly before, and the shock of it had been enough to make them stop. But humanity had always seen itself clearly. That was the whole problem. That was the whole miracle. The pilot on the Rampart looked at the truth the Vrecht showed him, and thought, "Yes, I was afraid, and I left her, and I have carried that every day, and I am still flying." The engineer on the Steady Hand looked at the truth and thought, Yes, I drink, and yes, I am scared, and I fixed the reactor coupling at Kellori, while I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the wrench, and it held. The sergeant on the Born Angry looked at the truth and thought, yes, I am a killer, and I am standing between those things and everyone I love, and I will not apologize for that. One by one across the fleet, humans did what humans had always done when confronted with the worst parts of themselves. They got angry. Not at the Vrecht, but at the assumption behind the attack. The assumption that knowing what you are means you have to stop. The fleet began to accelerate again. Saith gasped, and her crystal body flared white. And Tavolk turned to her in alarm, and she said, "They know. They have always known, and they are choosing." Morvex stared at the display as the human ships picked up speed, and said, "Choosing what?" "To go anyway." The Defiance hit the outer perimeter of the Vrecht Nexus at full combat speed, and Rena was standing, because she refused to sit for this, and the mirror field was screaming inside her head, showing her every mistake she had ever made, and every person she had failed to save, and every dark, selfish, frightened corner of her soul. She saw herself at 19, stealing supplies from a refugee camp because she was hungry. She saw herself at 30, ordering a retreat that left 200 people behind. She saw herself at 45, smiling at a diplomatic reception, while people she had promised to protect were dying 3 systems away. She saw all of it, and it was all true, and the Vrecht waited for her to collapse, the way everyone else had collapsed. Reyna looked at the image of herself that the hive mind held up in front of her, every flaw and failure and weakness made manifest. And she said, "I know." The image flickered. "I know all of this," she said. "I have known all of this since I was old enough to look in a mirror and hate what I saw, and I did not need you to tell." She stepped forward on the bridge, and the mirror field pressed harder, and showed her worse things, and deeper shames. And she kept walking. "You think this is a weapon," she said. "You think that if you show people what they really are, they will break. And you are right, it works on every species that has never had to live with itself." She reached the forward viewport, and pressed her hand against the glass, and her reflection stared back at her from the darkness of space. "But we have always lived with ourselves, and we have always hated parts of what we see, and we have always gotten up the next morning anyway. And that is not strength, it is just stubbornness. It is just the inability to stop when any sane creature would have stopped a long time ago." She pressed her forehead against the glass, and closed her eyes, and the mirror field threw everything it had at her, and she let it come. And then she did something that the Vrecht hive mind had never experienced in 12,000 years of consuming civilizations. She did not fight the reflection. She did not look away from it. She accepted it, not with peace and not with joy, but with the tired, stubborn grace of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that it has become part of their skeleton. And she whispered, "You are me, and I am you, and I am not proud of everything we have done, but I am not done yet." The mirror field shattered, not because Rena destroyed it, but because the Vrecht psychic network was built on a single fundamental principle: that self-knowledge is a weapon, and that showing a creature what it truly is will always break it, because no living thing can survive the full, unfiltered truth of itself. And Rena Vasquez stood in the full, unfiltered truth of herself and said, "Yes, and what else do you have?" The feedback loop started in the Nexus core and spread outward through the hive mind like a crack in ice. Vrecht could not process what was happening. A mind that held its own darkness and its own light at the same time, and did not break, and did not look away, and did not pretend. It was impossible. Every species was one thing or another, predator or prey, kind or cruel, strong or weak. And the Vrecht mirror showed them the other side, and the contradiction destroyed them. But this species was already both sides, and always had been, and the mirror showed them nothing they did not already carry every single day. The Nexus station began to shake, and the hive mind screamed across every psychic frequency. And it was not a scream of pain, but of confusion, because for the first time in its ancient existence, it had looked into a mirror and seen something it could not understand. A creature that contained everything, darkness and light, and cruelty and kindness, and fear and courage, and did not shatter from the contradiction. A creature that was at war with itself and used that war as fuel. A creature that looked at its own shadow and said, "I know you, and you do not get to stop me." The Nexus collapsed, and the hive mind fragmented into 1,000 pieces that scattered into dark space. And the wrecked fleet went still and silent, and the dying red sun shone through the wreckage like a wound in the sky. On the observation vessel, Tavok stood in silence for a long time, and then he turned to Saith and asked the question that would haunt the Concord for generations. "What archetype is that?" Saith looked at him with light patterns that cycled through every color she had, and several that her species had never produced before. "There is no archetype," she said. "There is only the choice." "What choice?" "The choice to look and to keep going, and they make it every single moment of every single day. And I do not think they even realize how extraordinary that is." Tavok looked back at the display where the Defiance hung motionless in the wreckage of the wrecked Nexus, and he thought about a child in a puddle, and he understood at last what he had been watching all along. Not madness, not bravery, just the simple, terrible, beautiful refusal to stop being at war with the only enemy that could never be defeated: themselves. The galaxy was quiet in a way it had not been quiet for 600 years, and the quiet felt strange because it was not the quiet of holding your breath and waiting for something terrible. It was the quiet that comes after the storm, when the wind stops and the sky opens up, and you realize you are still standing. The wrecked were not dead. Fragments of the hive mind had scattered into the deep black spaces between stars, and they would drift there for centuries or longer. And perhaps someday they would reform, and perhaps they would not. But for now, the consumption had stopped, and 43 star systems were no longer being eaten alive. The Concord sent recovery fleets to the liberated worlds, and what they found there was grim. Decades of wrecked occupation had stripped most of them down to bare rock and dead soil, and the rebuilding would take generations. But they could be rebuilt, and that was the thing that mattered. Tavok returned to the Concord Senate on Ilvet Station, and he brought with him 17 years of observations and notes and recordings, and the Senate listened to all of it, in a silence that grew heavier with every hour. When he finished, High Senator Morvek stood up, and his heavy-plated body creaked with the effort, because Morvek was old now, and the war had aged him in ways that time alone could not. "The archetype system," Morvek said, and his voice was rough, "has served the Concord for 11,000 years, and in that time it has been wrong exactly once." He looked around the chamber. Once was enough. The vote to dissolve the archetype classification system passed with only 3 dissenting voices, and when it was done, the chamber was silent again, and Tavok realized that the silence was not grief, but relief. The relief of setting down a weight you had been carrying so long that you had forgotten it was heavy. The Concord had spent 11,000 years telling every species what it was, and every species had accepted the label and lived inside it. And now, for the first time in all those long years, the labels were gone. And the question was no longer, what are you? But what do you choose to be? It was a human question, and it terrified the Concord, and it also set them free. Saith completed her empathic profile of humanity on the same day the archetype system was dissolved, and she submitted it to the Senate records, where it would be preserved for as long as the Concord existed. The profile was one line long. They are what they choose to be, and they choose every moment. The Senate archivist asked if she wanted to add more detail, and Sci-Fi said no, because anything more would be a lie, and the truth about humanity could not be made longer without making it smaller. She retired from diplomatic service after that, and spent her remaining years teaching young Ilhari students about the species that had broken every rule the galaxy thought was unbreakable. And when her students asked her what the most important thing she had learned from humanity was, she always told them the same story. I watched their admiral stand in front of a weapon that shows you the worst of yourself, she would say. And I watched her look at it and say yes, and then keep walking. And I realized that I had spent my entire life reading other beings, and I had never once asked myself the question she asked. What question? The students would say. Not what am I, but what am I going to do about it? Rena Vasquez resigned her commission 6 months after the fall of the wrecked Nexus, and she did it quietly, without ceremony or speeches, because she was tired of speeches, and tired of being the face of something that had never been about one person. She went back to Earth for a while, and lived in a small house near the coast, where she could hear the ocean at night, and she slept badly, because the faces of everyone she had lost came to visit her in the dark, and she woke up every morning and looked in the mirror, and the mirror showed her everything it had always shown her. She did not look away. She did not smile at what she saw. She just got dressed and went about her day. The Concord invited her to the dedication of a memorial on the first liberated world, a planet called Calori Prime, that had been the site of the first battle, and was now slowly coming back to life as Concord engineers coaxed green things to grow in the dead gray soil. Rena almost did not go, because memorials made her feel like a fraud, like standing in front of a list of names and pretending that she had earned the right to be alive, when they were not. But she went, because the dead deserved someone to stand for them, even if that someone was imperfect, and especially if that someone was imperfect. The memorial was a wall of polished stone that reflected the sky, and the names carved into it caught the light of Calori's twin sons, and Rena stood in front of it and read the names one by one and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the names did not already say better. She stood there for a long time, and then she heard a sound behind her, a small sound like a hand patting the ground, and she turned around. A Kenthari child was sitting in the grass near the edge of the memorial garden, and it was young, very young, with soft gray fur, and 4 of its 6 limbs were folded underneath it, and the other 2 were reaching forward toward a section of the polished memorial wall that sat low to the ground. The child was staring at its own reflection. Its face was scrunched up in that particular way that children have when they are trying to understand something that does not make sense. And it kept tilting its head back and forth and watching the reflection tilt with it. And there was confusion in its eyes, and something else that Rena recognized immediately. Fear. Not of the reflection exactly, but of the question the reflection was asking. Who are you? And what does it mean, and why does the thing in the surface look like you, but also not like you? Rena walked over slowly, because she had learned a long time ago that you don't approach frightened children quickly, and she knelt down beside the Kenthari cub, and the cub looked up at her with wide dark eyes. Scary, is it not? Rena said softly. The cub blinked at her, and then looked back at the wall, and then back at Rena. Rena looked at the wall too, and she could see both of their reflections now. The tired human woman with gray in her hair and lines around her eyes, and the small alien child with soft fur and too many limbs. And both reflections looked back at them with the patient blankness that reflections always have. I will tell you a secret, Rena said. When I was very small, I saw my reflection for the first time, and I did not like it. I hid it, and it did not go away, and I cried. And then I hid it again. The cub, made a small sound that might have been a question. "I spent my whole life doing that," Rena said, "fighting the thing in the mirror, and trying to make it go away, and trying to make it into something I liked better. And you want to know what I figured out?" The cub looked at her. "You do not have to like what you see," Rena said. "You really do not, and nobody can make you like it. And anyone who tells you that you should like everything about yourself is either lying or has not looked hard enough." She reached out and placed her hand gently against the polished wall, and her reflection did the same, and the cub watched with wide eyes. "The trick," Rena said, "is that you just have to decide what you are going to do about it, and you have to make that decision every single day, and some days you will make it well, and some days you will make it badly, and that is fine, because the deciding is the part that matters, not the getting it right." The cub looked at the wall again, and this time the fear in its eyes was a little smaller. It reached out one small limb, slowly and carefully, and placed it against the polished stone. Its reflection reached back. The cub did not hit the surface, and it did not pull away, and it did not cry. It just held its hand there and looked at the thing that looked back at it, and for one small quiet moment, in a garden on a world that had been dead and was now learning to be alive again, a child saw itself and chose not to be afraid. Rena smiled. It was not a big smile, and it was not a perfect smile, and it was the kind of smile that only comes from someone who has earned it the hard way. But it was real, and it was enough. She stood up slowly, because her knees were not what they used to be, and she brushed the grass off her pants, and she looked at the cub one more time. "You are going to be fine." Then she turned and walked toward the edge of the garden, where the path led out into the open, and the twin suns of Kalori hung low and golden in the sky. And her shadow stretched out long behind her on the grass. The shadow followed her, the way shadows always do, silent and dark and shaped exactly like the thing that casts it. It would always follow. It would always be there. Every step she took, it would take, and every turn she made, it would make. And on dark days it would seem larger than she was, and on bright days it would shrink to almost nothing. But it would never leave, because that is what shadows do. But Rena Vasquez was the one who walked. She was the one who decided which direction to go, and how fast, and whether to stop or keep moving, and the shadow had no say in any of it. Because shadows do not choose, they only follow. And that was the secret that humanity had carried with it since the very first child looked into a puddle, saw something, looking back, and chose to fight it. The shadow is real. The darkness is real. The ugly things in the mirror are true. But you are the one who walks, and the shadow is the one who follows. And as long as you keep choosing to move forward, it does not matter how dark the thing behind you is, because it will never be the one who decides where you go. Rena walked into the light of an alien sun on a world that had been saved by a species that could not even save itself from itself. And behind her, the shadow stretched and shifted and followed, as it always would, as it always had. And in the garden, a small alien child held its hand against its own reflection and began very slowly to understand something that humanity had spent its entire existence learning. The mirror is not the enemy. The reflection is not the enemy. The only enemy is the moment you stop looking, and the only defeat is the moment you stop choosing. Long as you keep your hand against the glass and your eyes on the thing that stares back at you, then you are still in the fight. And the fight is all there is. And the fight is enough.